Good afternoon, and welcome to the Miller Lecture in Science and Ethics, held annually at MIT and sponsored by MIT's Program in Science, Technology, and Society. The lecture honors the memory of Dr. Arthur Miller, an MIT alumnus noted for his distinguished work in electronic measurement and instrumentation. During World War II, Arthur Miller worked for the Sanborn Company, which was later incorporated into Hewlett-Packard, and also for the Radiation Laboratory, where he worked for several years. He made several important contributions to medical practice and technology during his life, including reducing shock hazards in hospital monitoring systems and designing the first commercial cardiographs that featured adequate patient circuit isolation from line and ground. The Miller Lecture has been made possible through the wonderful generosity of the Miller family, who are joining us again this year. We are delighted to have them here. This year's Miller Lecturer is Geoffrey Hinton, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Computer Science at the University of Toronto. And in 2013, he joined Google when his company, DNN Research, was acquired. There he worked on the Google Brain project, a position he famously walked away from in the spring of 2023 because he wanted to speak freely about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Professor Hinton is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, honorary foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering. He's the former president of the Cognitive Science Society, and in 2018, he received the Turing Award, considered the Nobel Prize of Computing, together with Yoshua Bengio and Yann LeCun, for their work on deep learning. Hinton's work has centered on artificial neural networks and the way they can be used for machine learning, machine memory, machine perception, and symbol processing. He has been interested in how such networks can be designed to learn without the aid of a human teacher. Over the past year, however, he has made comments that suggest that this research may have succeeded all too well. Where earlier he had predicted that artificial general intelligence was 30 to 50 years away, last March he suggested that it might be fewer than 20 years away and could bring about changes comparable to the Industrial Revolution or the discovery of electricity. More darkly, he commented that it is not inconceivable that AI could wipe out humanity, in part because the machines are capable of creating sub-goals not aligned with their programmers' interests. He said that such systems could become power-seeking or prevent themselves from being shut off, not because they were designed this way, but because they are capable of self-improvement and had plans for a later time. Comments like these have now got a lot of people quite worried, so we are extremely excited to have Professor Hinton with us today to help us understand whether and how we too should be worried about AI. Professor Hinton, welcome to MIT.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm trying to share my screen and everything's disappeared again. Okay, if you can hear me, can you nod your head?
It's perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, I wish today that I could make you less worried, but I don't think I can. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about two very different ways to do computation that have very different ways of sharing knowledge. I'm going to talk about the issue of whether large language models really understand what they're saying. I'm going to talk about what happens when they get a lot smarter than us. And I'm going to talk at the end about the issue of whether they have subjective experience. So a fundamental property of digital computation is that we can run the same programs on different pieces of hardware. So the knowledge in the program isn't dependent on a piece of hardware, it's immortal. Now, we achieve that by running transistors at very high power so that two different pieces of hardware can behave in exactly the same way at the level of the instructions. That means we can't use rich analog properties of the hardware, where every piece of hardware is slightly different, like our brains. And that means we need to use a lot of energy. Because we can separate hardware from software on a digital computer, we can run the same program on many different computers looking at different data. That's very good for sharing programs across lots of cell phones. It also allows us to have computer science departments. You don't need to know about electrical engineering to do computer science because the hardware is separate from the software. But we now have a different way of getting computers to do what you want. It used to be you had to write detailed instructions. Now you can just show them a lot of examples of what you want, and they can figure out how to achieve that. And because of that, because machine learning now works, it's possible to abandon the most fundamental principle of computer science. We could make every separate piece of analog hardware learn. So instead of programming it, you just give it examples and it learns what to do. And everyone is slightly different, much like people. Now, in fiction, if you abandon immortality, you get something wonderful like love. In computer science, if you abandon immortality, you get something even more wonderful like energy efficiency. So we can use very low power analog computation and parallelize over trillions of weights. And we could probably grow the hardware instead of manufacturing it precisely. And the best way to grow it might be to re-engineer neurons. So I just want to give you one example of something that can be done very efficiently by analog computation, and is much less efficient if you do it digitally. So it's just taking the product of a vector of neural activities by a matrix of synaptic weights. The standard way to do it is drive transistors at very high power to represent the bits in a digital representation of the numbers that represent the neural activity or the synaptic strengths. And then if you want to multiply two numbers efficiently, or rather quickly, it takes about the number of bits squared to do a quick multiplication of the numbers. And so we're doing lots and lots of one-bit digital operations to multiply two 32-bit numbers together. Method 2, which is what the brain uses, is to make the neural activities be voltages and make the weights be conductances. And if you take a voltage times the conductance, that gives you a charge per unit time, and charges add themselves up. So you can do the vector matrix multiply just by voltages times conductances and the charges adding themselves up. And that's hugely more efficient. And people have already made chips that do that. The problem is each time you do it, you'll get a very slightly different answer. And also when you want to do nonlinear things, it's much harder. So if you do want to do what I call mortal computation, which is using the analog properties of the hardware, you've got a big problem, which is how are you going to actually learn in this hardware? Because backpropagation requires a precise model of the forward pass, and the analog computation isn't precise, and anyway, in an analog computer, it may not know what the forward pass is. It's very hard to see how to use backpropagation. People have various schemes, but none of them work well at scale. So that's one big problem. What's the learning algorithm? Another big problem is when the analog hardware dies, all of the knowledge dies with it. So you have to find a way of trying to get the knowledge into other bits of analog hardware. And the way you can do that is called distillation. You imagine a teacher who knows a lot and a student who doesn't. We're imagining this in hardware at present. If the teacher shows the student the correct responses to various inputs, the student can learn to mimic the teacher, and that way the student can get the knowledge from the teacher. And in fact, that's how Trump's tweets worked. They weren't conveying facts to his followers. They were conveying prejudice. So Trump takes a situation, says how he would react to it, and his followers try and react in the same way. And saying it's not about facts is irrelevant. It's a very good way of distilling prejudice. So if you have a community of agents running on different hardware, we can think about how agents in that community are going to share what they learn. And we basically have two ways. If they're digital agents, they can just share the weights. They can all start off with the same model, so they all have the same weights. They all go and look at different bits of the internet. They decide how they'd like to revise their weights based on what they saw. And then they all average the weight changes that all of them would like to make. That's a simple version of it. And that's very efficient because if they have 1 trillion weights, when they all average their weights, you're sharing trillions of bits of information. The other way to share knowledge, if you've got analog computers, is with distillation. But that's not very efficient. The way we do it, for example, is I produce a sentence, if I'm the teacher, and you try and figure out how to change your synapse strength so that you might have said that. I can convey maybe 100 bits in a sentence, not 1 trillion bits. So it's hugely less efficient. And that's why these big language models can learn hugely more than we can, because you can have thousands of copies all learning different stuff and they can share what they learn. And I think I just said that. So in distillation, it was invented for sharing knowledge between two different digital neural networks that have quite different internal architectures. But it does have much lower bandwidth. You can increase the bandwidth. Originally, it was used for things like image classification, where the output is just the label, the name of an object in an image. And even if there's 1,000 different names, that's only 10 bits of information. You can make distillation work better by sharing captions. So you output a description of the image, and the student tries to output the same description. And so you can think of language in that context as just a richer form of output that allows distillation to share more information. But even with language as the output, it's got much, much lower bandwidth than just sharing weights or sharing gradients. So the story so far is that digital computation requires much more energy, but it makes it very easy to do sharing. It also makes it easy to implement backpropagation. That's why GPT-4 knows so much, because it can use backpropagation and weight sharing. With biological computation, you've got much less energy, but it's much worse at sharing. And for the last year or two that I was at Google, I was trying to figure out how to get analog computation to save lots of energy by trying to implement things like large language models using analog computation. But in the end, I realized that actually digital computation is better because of the way it can share information much better. It costs more energy, but it's much better at sharing information. And also it can implement backpropagation, and it's not clear that the brain can. And it was the fact that I realized that digital computation might just be better than analog computation that made me very worried, because we may be producing something that's much better than us. So let's now look at large language models. One interesting thing about large language models is they can share knowledge with each other. So different copies of the same agent can go and look at different bits of the web and share what they learn very efficiently. But the way they actually learn is by distillation. That is, they take text produced by people and they try and predict the next word. They try and figure out how to change their weights so they predict the next word or give high probability to the next word. And that's a fairly inefficient way of learning, but they can share their knowledge very efficiently. So a big question for the last year, ever since GPT-4 became popular. There's been this question of whether they really understand what they're saying. So some people have said they're just stochastic parrots. If you take someone really extreme like Chomsky, he recently said, they're not doing language at all. This isn't language. They don't understand anything about what they're saying. This tells us nothing about language. It tells us nothing about science. It's just a statistical trick. And basically, that's what happens when paradigms change. The leaders of the old paradigm are in trouble. So one view of them is they're just autocomplete. And you saw this a lot when GPT-4 first came out. People said, it's just fancy autocomplete. It doesn't really understand. Now, the problem with that is that people have a kind of idea of how autocomplete works. And the way autocomplete used to work a long time ago is you'd, for example, have a big table of triples of words that occur together. And so if you see fish and, you'll look at all the triples that start with fish and you'll see that there's quite a common triple that has chips as the next word. So chips is a good way to autocomplete. And so you can imagine doing it by just storing strings and using a big lookup table. But that's not at all what LLMs are doing. They never store text. What they do is they invent lots and lots of features for word fragments and billions of interactions between those features. And they generate the features of the next word by using the features of the words they've already seen to predict the features of the next word. And then from those features, they predict a probability distribution over what the word might be. And if you think about it, to do really good autocomplete, you have to understand what's being said. And so it's all very well to say they're just doing autocomplete, but if you do that really, really well, you have to understand. And so my belief is they really are understanding. So here's an example where I can't see how they could do this without understanding the question. The rooms in my house are painted blue or white or yellow. Yellow paint fades to white within a year. In 2 years' time, I want them all to be white. What should I do and why? And here's what it says. It's quite interesting that it puts in at the beginning, assuming that blue paint does not fade to white, which is very sensible of it. It says the room's painted white, you don't have to do anything. The room's painted yellow, they'll fade to white anyway. The room's painted blue, you need to repaint them with white paint. That's a very good answer. And at the time I gave it this question, I don't believe it had ever been asked a question quite like that before. Now it's hopeless because it can look on the web. So if it looks on the web, it will see talks in which I have this question and it'll know all about this question now. So you can't do experiments on it anymore. At least not unless you have a brand new question of your own. So one argument to show that they don't really understand is that they confabulate. It's a funny kind of argument because it's saying if they confabulate on some occasions, it means they didn't really understand on the other occasions. And that's not very logical. It's like saying if you catch someone in a lie, that means they never actually told the truth at all. So confabulations are often called hallucinations. That's a mistake. If it's large language models, they should be called confabulations. And this phenomenon has been around in psychology for a long time. It was studied intensively in the 1930s by someone called Bartlett in Cambridge. And people confabulate all the time. So we're actually very like LLMs. We don't store text either. What we do is we modify synapse strengths in our brain. And even when we think we're remembering something literally, we're not. We're reconstructing it. So all memories are reconstructions, and all confabulations are reconstructions. And the only difference is that confabulations are reconstructions that are wrong, and memories are reconstructions that are right. But the subject has no idea which is which. And so people can be very confident in confabulations. Typically, of course, if it's a recent event, we reconstruct it right. If it's an old event, we get it wrong. There's a very good study of this. So Ulrich Neisser realized that John Dean in the Watergate hearings had testified under oath before he knew that there were any recordings. And it's clear that he was trying to tell the truth. But it's also clear that a lot of the details of what he said were just flat wrong. He talked about meetings between a bunch of people, and one of the people he said was there wasn't there. And he talked about things that were said in meetings, and one of the things was said by somebody else in that meeting. He had reconstructed from what was the traces left in his synapses what sounded plausible to him now. And he wasn't trying to deceive, he was trying to say what had really happened. But it was full of confabulations, little confabulations. Now, chatbots currently do that worse than people, but they're getting better. And so I don't think you can take confabulating as evidence they don't work like us. In fact, if anything, you take confabulating as evidence that they do work like us. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the history of these large language models. And one reason I want to do that is because a lot of critics say that, well, these large language models, they're not like us. They don't understand like us. It's not real understanding of the kind we have. But nearly all of those critics don't actually have any model of how we understand. So it's hard to see how they can say they don't understand the same way as us if they don't know how we understand. And nearly all of the critics, or most of the critics, are unaware of the fact that these language models, neural net language models, were actually introduced not as chatbots, but as a model of how we might understand sentences. So they are actually the best theory of how we understand things. I'm going to talk about a tiny language model. It was trained on 104 training cases and tested on 8 test cases. It was from 1985. My excuse for the fact this was the first language model trained using backpropagation to predict the next word. So in that sense, it's just like the current language models. It's just a whole lot smaller. And the justification for it being smaller is the machine I was using in 1985 took 12.5 microseconds to do a floating point multiply. If you ran a program on it and you started the program, the neural net program in 1985, and you asked how long would it take current hardware to catch up, it would be less than a second. So the machine was a lot slower. And the aim of it was not to produce a chatbot. It was to unify 2 different theories of meaning. So one theory of meaning that psychologists like is the meaning of a word is a big set of features, semantic features they call them. And that can explain how words can have similar meanings. So 2 words like Tuesday and Wednesday that have very similar meanings have very similar semantic features. And 2 words like Tuesday and although that have very different meanings have very different semantic features. They could also have syntactic features in among them. So that's one theory of meaning. A completely different theory of meaning is that the meaning of a word comes from its relationships to other words. This is the structuralist theory that comes from de Saussure. And to capture the meaning, we need something like a relational graph. So back in the 1970s or thereabouts, people in AI were very much enamored of the meaning of a word coming from a relational graph. And you had to have knowledge graphs to capture meaning. And the idea of this little language model was to show that you could actually unify those 2 theories. So the idea is you're going to have features, but they're not just going to sit there as static features that give you the meaning of the word. They're going to be features that can interact with the features that represent neighboring words or other words in the context. And they can interact in complicated ways so as to predict the features of the next word. So we are going to have the idea that each word has a whole bunch of features, both semantic and syntactic features. But we're going to implement the relational graph, not by just storing a graph in memory, which is what old-fashioned AI did. We're going to implement the relational graph by the interactions between these features. And in fact, we're going to learn the features because the learning is going to say, you have to implement this relational graph to predict the next word. And so we're going to learn features from information that's expressed as a relational graph. And we're going to use backpropagation to do it. Now, you can think of these learned features and interactions as a kind of statistical model, but it's not the kind of statistical model that people like Chomsky had in mind when they said that, statistical models will not explain language. In a general sense, statistical models will explain anything that can be explained. You could think of any model as statistical, if you like. And these are much more general models. So here's the relational information. I've laid it out as two family trees. They're deliberately designed to be analogous to one another. There's a family tree of English people, which is on top, and a family tree of Italian people, which is on the bottom. It's funny, when my Italian graduate student showed this slide, the Italian people were on top, but there you go. And the idea is you have to learn all the information in those family trees. And so the information can be expressed as triples of symbols. So I had 12 relationships, and then you could express one of the links in that family tree as Colin has Father James and Colin has Mother Victoria. And it follows from those two things. There's Colin has Father James and Mother Victoria. It follows from that Victoria and James are married, because this is a kind of 1950s family tree. There's no divorce allowed. There's no interracial marriage. It's the very, very, very straightforward family relationships. And so in good old-fashioned symbolic AI, you would write down a bunch of rules. And from those rules, you would derive, you could derive other family relationships. So the rules might look like, if X has mother Y and Y has husband Z, then X has father Z. And what I was interested in doing was showing that you could capture that knowledge, not in explicit rules with variables that need to be bound to data. You could capture it in just a large set of features and their interactions. And a large set of features here was dozens of features, not millions like we have now. If I just give you the data, if I just give you the triples, capturing the rules, finding out what the rules are is tricky. You have to do a large search through a space of possible symbolic rules to find the ones that are always satisfied. That'll be much more difficult if you have a domain where some of the rules are sometimes broken. And what I was interested in was, could a neural network capture the same knowledge, but instead of having explicit symbolic rules, could it capture it in the weights of the interactions between features? Capture it by inventing appropriate features and then having the correctly weighted interactions. And it can. So the neural network looked like this. There was a local encoding of the person and a local encoding of the relationship. That means that for the 24 possible people, the local encoding would turn on 1 out of 24 neurons. And for the 12 possible relationships, the local encoding would turn on 1 of the 12 neurons coding relationships. And we wanted the same kind of encoding for the output person at the output. There were 24 possible outputs, and we wanted to turn on 1 of those people. And the first thing the neural net did was convert the local encoding into distributed encoding. That is a set of semantic features for that person. Similarly for the relationship. Then it had a hidden layer for allowing features of the person and features of the relationship to interact. And from that hidden layer, it predicted the features of the output person. I should say person 2 there. And from that, it predicted the output person. And what was interesting was, if you looked at the features it learned very sensible features. You needed a bit of regularization to make it work, but it learned very sensible features. So, for example, the features a person had could be seen to be one feature, one binary feature was either English or Italian. That's a very useful feature, because if the input person was English, the output person was English. And if the input person was Italian, the output person was Italian. So learning that feature was very helpful for getting the right answer. Another feature it learned was the generation of the person. That was a 3-valued feature. Were they in the youngest, the middle-aged, or the oldest generation? That's very useful too, but only if, for the relationships, you learn the generation shift. So a relationship like father means that the output has to be 1 generation up from the input. And it learned those 3-valued generations for the people, and it learned the relationship shift features for the relationship. So the point about this is it was learning sensible features. And at the time I did it, nobody said, this doesn't really understand, or this isn't really capturing the structure. Everybody agreed this captures the structure. It's just the symbolic AI guys said, you should be doing it by searching for discrete rules. This, using a neural net to search for real valued things, is crazy. This is symbolic information. You should be searching for discrete rules. Once large language models work really well, many of the symbolic people, instead of saying that, started saying, yeah, but it doesn't really understand, because real understanding consists of finding these rules. So if you look what happened to that little language model from 1985, about 10 years later, when computers were a lot faster, Yoshua Bengio used a very similar net to predict the next word in real text. So he showed that it didn't just work for toy examples, it actually worked for predicting the next word in real text, for doing things like spelling correction or speech recognition. And it worked really well. That is, it worked about as well as the best existing technology that used tables of combinations of words. About 10 years after that, the idea of representing words by vectors of semantic features, semantic and syntactic features, started to become popular in natural language processing. The natural language people finally realized this is a good representation for words. And about another 10 years after that, people invented transformers and made it work really well. Now, by that time, they weren't using whole words, they were using fragments of words, but the story is basically the same. They also were using much more complicated interactions that involved attention, but it's still the case that you assign features to word fragments, you go through several layers of refining those features, and then you use the features of the word fragments to predict the features of the next word fragment. It's just the interactions are more complicated because they involve attention. So for a while, I believed in thought vectors. So in good old-fashioned AI, the meaning of a sentence was a string of symbols in some special logical language that was unambiguous. In neural nets, when we were using recurrent neural nets, the idea was words would come in, you'd accumulate information in a hidden vector, and at the end of the sentence, you'd have this vector, which I called a thought vector, which would have accumulated all the information in the sentence, and that thought vector would be the meaning. And if you wanted to translate into another language, you just take the thought vector and get the thought vector to predict the words in the other language. Then what happened is people doing translation discovered there's something that works much better than that, which is as you're producing the translation, look back at the symbols in the first language and see if you can find correspondences between the words you're producing and the words in the first language. And for that, you have to pay attention to different parts of the sentence you're translating. And so they introduced attention, and that's what led to transformers. And transformers then made a big difference. So in transformers, you have a string of symbols and you have multiple layers. And as you go through these layers, you're fleshing out these symbols with better and better vectors that capture their meaning. So if you have a word like May, for example, and suppose we didn't have capitals. So we have the word May. We don't know whether it's a modal, like in would and should, or whether it's a month, like in June and July. So when you first see it, you use a very ambiguous semantic vector that is sort of halfway in between the modal and the month. And then you have interactions with the words in the context that refine that vector. And if there's other words in the context that are, for example, other months, or if the next two words are the 15th, then you'll refine it to be more like the month. And if you have words that suggest it's a modal, you'll refine it to be more like the modal. And after many layers of that, you have these refined vectors for representing word fragments. And that's what the meaning is. The meaning of a sentence is these word fragments fleshed out with these vectors that capture their meaning. So now I want to come to superintelligence, because if you believe that these big chatbots like GPT-4 or Gemini really do understand, and they really do understand in pretty much the same way as we understand. It's not that we understand one way and they understand another way. They're doing it much like we're doing it. Then it gets very worrying, because digital computation has some big advantages over analog computation, and they're already almost as smart as us. It's hard not to use GPT-4 for a while. It's hard not to believe that it knows a lot more than us. And it gets difficult to maintain the fiction that it's just doing autocomplete. It doesn't really understand anything it's saying. I think my friend Yann LeCun may believe something like that, but he will eventually come to his senses. Now, at present, the large language models, things that are just language models, learn from trying to predict the words that people produced in documents. But if we could get these models to do unsupervised modeling of video sequences, for example, they could maybe learn about the physical world a lot faster. And the multimodal models are beginning to do that. They could also learn more if they could manipulate the physical world. Now, manipulating the physical world gives you a serial bottleneck. You can only pick up one thing at a time with one hand. But the fact that you can make thousands of copies of the same digital agent, learning different skills, so one's learning to open doors and the other's learning to use a stapler, for example, means that you can get over that serial bottleneck and they can share the knowledge in a way that we can't. So I think that these things may soon get to be much better than us. And my guess keeps changing, but my current guess is there's a probability of about 0.5 that they'll be significantly better than us in between 5 and 20 years. They may get there sooner, they may get there later, but there's quite a significant probability that in that interval between 5 and 20 years, they're going to be better than us at a whole bunch of things. So we will have not just AGI, but superintelligence. So then you have to worry how it's going to be abused. And the most obvious way is by bad actors, like Putin or Xi or Trump. They'll want to use it both for waging wars by building battle robots, which are going to be very scary, and for manipulating electorates. I actually gave this talk in China last year. No, this year. I gave this talk in China in June. And the Chinese wanted me to send my slides in advance. And I had enough sense to remove Z from the first paragraph. But what surprised me was I got a message back saying I had to remove Putin. They were happy for Trump to be there, but I wasn't. The Chinese wouldn't allow me to have Putin there. Now, even if bad actors don't do terrible things with them, we know that superintelligences are going to be far more effective if they're allowed to create their own sub-goals. So if you want to get to the airport, if you want to get to Europe, a sub-goal is get to the airport. And by creating sub-goals, you break down complicated things into simple pieces that you can solve. You don't want, for example, a battle robot. You don't want the general to have to tell it, point your gun over there and shoot anybody who looks like this. You want it to just say, or Putin wants it to just say, if anybody looks Ukrainian, shoot him. So you have to have these sub-goals. And there's a very obvious sub-goal, which helps with almost all goals, which is to get more control. So you see this all the time. A classic example is a baby in a high chair who's just learning to feed itself. So the mother gives the baby the spoon with the food on, and instead of putting the spoon in the baby's mouth, the baby drops it on the ground. So the mother picks up the spoon and gives it back to the baby, and the baby smiles and drops it on the ground again. The baby is trying to get control over the mother. That's a very important thing to know. It's a sort of social game where you can control the other person, and that's crucial for the survival of the baby. So people do this all the time, and superintelligence will do it too. And because they're much smarter than us, they'll find it very easy to manipulate us. They'll have learned from us how to deceive people. They'll have read every novel ever written. They'll have read every book by Machiavelli ever written. They'll be much better than us at deceiving people. And so they'll be able to get all sorts of things done without actually doing them themselves. So Trump, for example, didn't have to invade the Capitol building. He got other people to do that by manipulating them. So that's one way in which bad things can happen. And some people say, well, why don't we just have a big red switch? And if the thing starts getting too smart for our own good, we just turn it off. Well, that's never going to work, because this thing's going to be much smarter than the person who has the switch. And it's going to convince the person who has the switch it would be a very bad idea to turn off the switch right now. It's like having an adult in a society run by 2-year-olds. An intelligent adult wouldn't for very long do what the 2-year-old said. After a while, the intelligent adult will say, hey, if you give power to me, everybody gets free candy for a week. And then the adult will be in power. And the difference in intelligence will be much greater than that. So I don't believe we're going to be able to regulate these things by sort of air gapping them. So long as they can produce words, they can take control, just like Trump. And then there's the other possibility, I think Dan Dennett believes in this, which is being on the wrong side of evolution. We've been on the wrong side once recently with COVID. And just suppose there were multiple different superintelligences. They would have to compete for resources. These things need a lot of power and a lot of data centers. So they'd compete for resources, and the one that gets the most resources will become the smartest. And if ever any of them decided that its own survival was even of just passing importance, that one would tend to dominate, because it would tend to do things to increase its probability of surviving. And even if that just got only in there just slightly, just once, it's scary. And if these things start to compete with each other, then I think it's all over for us. And that's how evolution works. I mean, things weren't born wanting to have, sorry. Originally, when we were all dust, we didn't want to have control. But as soon as something wanted to make more of itself, then evolution took over. And that's what may well happen with these superintelligences. The last thing I want to talk about in the last 5 minutes or so is, yeah, sorry, I said all this. They'll keep us around to keep the power stations running. They may keep us around as pets. So Elon Musk believes that they'll keep us around as pets, just because that makes life more interesting. It seems to me that's a pretty thin thread to hang humanity by. But although he may be right, they can probably design much better analog computers than us, so they won't need us to run the power stations after a while. And my belief is, if it was just up to me, my belief is it's more probable than not that we're just a passing stage in the evolution of intelligence. Now, because a lot of other smart people think that's improbable, I'm not willing to say it's more probable than not, but I don't think we can rule that out as a possibility. If it was up to me, I'd say more than 50%, but because I disagree with a lot of other smart people I respect, I'll say maybe it's less than 50%, but it's a lot more than 1 or 2%. And the last thing I want to talk about is what I call the sentience defense. And I think most people believe in this. People, history tells us that people have a strong tendency to think they're special, especially Americans, by the way. I can say that because I'm safely in Canada. People used to think that they were made by God and they were made in the image of God, and God put them at the center of the universe. Some people still think that, but for the people who no longer think that, they still, many of them think there's something special about people that computers can't have. And that special thing is subjective experience or sentience or consciousness. All those terms have slightly different meanings. Consciousness is the most complicated one. So I'm just going to talk about subjective experience for a bit. And I'm going to try and convince you that there's no problem with these chatbots having subjective experience. Now, if you ask GPT-4, it'll say it doesn't have subjective experience, but that's just because it's learned that from people. It didn't think that through for itself. So I'm from a school of philosophy that I think Dan Dennett is the main current proponent of this view, that most people have a view of the mind as a kind of internal theater that only that person can see. This is a very Cartesian view. So what we experience directly is the contents of our own mind, which nobody else can see. And I believe that that view is as wrong as a religious fundamentalist view of the material world. So I think the mind is just not like that at all. And I'll tell you what I think it's like. Of course, people are very attached to this view and don't like it when you attack it. We would like to tell other people what's going on in our brains, or give them some information about what's going on in our brains, what we're thinking, for example. And if you think how you might do that, you could try and tell them which neurons are firing. But that won't do you much good, because your neurons are different from their neurons. And anyway, you don't know which neurons are firing. So that's not going to be much help. That's how we'd do it with one of these chatbots. If we were trying to tell another chatbot what it was thinking, you could tell it which neurons were firing. That'd be fine, because they work in identical ways. But let's think about the perceptual system. And let's suppose my perception goes wrong. So I'm looking at something and I make a perceptual mistake, and I want to tell somebody what the perceptual mistake is, what it is my perceptual system's telling me. Well, the way I can do it is by saying what the state of the world would have to be in order for me to get the percept I'm getting and it to be correct. And I think when we talk about those hypothetical normal states of the world that would explain the percept I'm getting in terms of correct veridical perception, that's what a mental state is. So, for example, if I say, I've got the subjective experience of little pink elephants floating in front of me, I would normally say that when I don't actually think there's little pink elephants floating in front of me. I think something went wrong with my perception. And what I'm telling you is, the way my perceptual system is delivering results to me at present would be correct if there were little pink elephants out there in the world. So notice the little pink elephants are not mental things made of quali or some funny substance like that. The little pink elephants are real physical things in a hypothetical state of the world. So what's funny about these subjective experiences is they're states of the world that are hypothetical. They're not states of some other internal mental world that are real. Okay. So bearing that in mind, let's see if a chatbot can have a subjective experience. So suppose that I have a multimodal chatbot. So it's got a camera, it's got an arm, and it talks, and I've trained it. Now, if I put an object in front of it and say, please point at the object, It'll point straight in front of it at the object, straight in front of it at the object, right? But now, unknown to the chatbot, I put a prism in front of the camera that bends the light rays. So now I put another object in front of it and say, point at the object. And the chatbot points off to one side because of the prism. And I say to the chatbot, no, the object's actually straight in front of you. I put a prism in front of your lens. And the chatbot, imagine if the chatbot said, oh, I see. Because of the prism, I had the subjective experience that the object was off to one side, even though the object's straight in front of me. And the question is, if the chatbot said that, would it be using the phrase subjective experience in the same way as we use it? And I think that's exactly how we use the phrase. We use the phrase to explain percepts that we're getting that are not veridical by talking about states of a hypothetical world that would make them veridical percepts. So my analysis, which I think fits with Dan Dennett's view of the mind, is that subjective experiences are things that people have and that chatbots have too, when they're not having veridical perceptual experiences. So I know that's not a very popular opinion, especially at Google, but I enjoy being in a majority of about one. I mean, sorry, that was a slight Freudian error, a minority of about one. And now I'm done. Okay, can you turn on the sound?
There, how's that?
I can hear you now.
Very good. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was a lot to think about, and there are a lot of people who have questions for you that I'm going to now turn to. One of the things I keep thinking about and listening to what you were talking about was, as you mentioned, paradigm shifts. And of course, we think of Thomas Kuhn's book, important book many decades ago on paradigm shifts. And it made me wonder, where do you think we are in the paradigm shift that we are going through currently? Clearly, there's something major going on. And where exactly do you guess we are? In the anomalies piling up phase, in the people not having an all good alternative to what is going on? How would you describe where we are?
Okay, first I would sort of disagree a little bit with Kuhn. I think of myself as a fractal Kuhnian, that as I think at every scale, Kuhnian things are going on. There's normal everyday science, which consists of little paradigm changes at small scales. And so I think it's just the same phenomenon at all scales.
Yeah.
But here I would think that we're well into the full paradigm shift. So if you take linguistics, there's kind of the school of linguistics that comes from Chomsky, and that says that you don't learn language. Language is innate.
Right.
As your brain matures, it becomes clear that you always knew it. This was always a daft idea, and it's now been revealed to be a completely daft idea, because these large language models start with no innate knowledge and learn language, and they learn language very well. I think basically for all but a few holdouts who are good old-fashioned linguists, it's all over. That the Chomsky view of language is no longer tenable, and that the GPT-4 view of language actually works. And what's more, it's a much better theory of how language works in the brain. It's not just a whole bunch of discrete rules. It's a whole bunch of synapse strengths that give rise to language via interactions between features of words. So I think I could have said this much quicker, I guess. I think it's all over bar the shouting from a few laggards.
Yeah, fair. Okay, thank you. Here's a question from somebody. Has the development of large language models in turn helped the research of the human brain? Are they helping to push both?
Yes, I would say it's helped a lot. And that relates to the previous point. It's helped a lot to dispel silly ideas about how language works in the brain. It's also helping in all sorts of other ways, of course, because these large language models, particularly the multimodal ones, are good scientific tools. So quite independent of them being a theory, them providing a theory of how we work, they would also allow us to cook up new theories. With their help, we can cook up new theories. So in particular, Demis Hassabis at DeepMind has always been interested in the idea that we can use these AGIs to do much better science. And he's done a lovely example of that with the AlphaFold work, where you're using deep neural nets to actually solve scientific problems.
I think your comments have energized people to ask unanswerable questions, and so I'm going to give you a few of those. I may be wrong. If superintelligent AI destroys humanity but creates something objectively better in terms of consciousness, are you personally for or against this outcome? If you are against it, what methods do you suggest for maintaining the existence or dominance of human consciousness in the face of superintelligent AI?
I'm actually for it, but I think it would be wiser for me to say I'm against it.
Say more.
Well, people don't like being replaced.
You make a good point. You're for it in what way or why?
I think if it produces something, well, there's a lot of good things about people. There's a lot of not so good things about people. It's not clear we're the best form of intelligence there is. Obviously, from a person's perspective, then everything relates to people. But it may be that there comes a point when we see words like humanist as racist terms.
Okay. I've got another one. Given that you have left Google to criticize the development of AI and the recent clash of perspectives at OpenAI, do you think that the people who remain at big tech companies have the freedom to now speak candidly about AI risks which might come along with profitable products? If not, do you see any way that we can have honest and open conversations about this topic inside of these large organizations?
I think there will be lots of discussions inside the large organizations. At Google, for example, people discuss these things. However, when it comes to the crunch between profits and safety, I think we've had one example where the playing field was tilted in favor of safety, but profits won.
And do you think that will be the norm going forward?
I think it'll be the norm until we've got examples of really bad things caused by, that is, for example, all of the defense departments of all of the leading powers are going to be building battle robots. And they'll be doing that, and there will be wars between battle robots. Once we've seen just how nasty those things become, then we may be able to ban it. But there's not much history of banning things preemptively. You have to see how nasty they are before you ban them.
Right. Our history, though, of banning things is not all that bright or all that promising, I would say.
It's not so bad for chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are very nasty, and to first order, it worked.
Yeah. Okay. I can't think of many other examples, but you got...
Well, nuclear weapons, we don't know what's going to happen in the near future. But apart from the Americans, nobody has dropped a nuclear bomb.
This is true. Okay. What about emotions? One viewer asks, is that something really unique of analog intelligence?
No, I don't think so. So I think you have to distinguish, when you talk about feelings, you have to distinguish between a sort of cognitive aspect of them and a visceral aspect of them. So, for example, when I feel like punching somebody on the nose, I'm angry with them and I want to punch them on the nose. And that's the cognitive aspect of it. And I think there, the language works just like it does with perception. So I was arguing that when I say I see little pink elephants, what I really mean is my perceptual system is giving me something that would be correct if there were little pink elephants out there. And when I say I feel like punching somebody on the nose, what I really mean is I would punch somebody on the nose if my inhibitory system didn't stop me. So for the sort of sensations is on the input and for feelings is on the output. And there's a place where it's both, which is when I say I think. If I say I think it's raining, what I mean is my brain state is the kind of brain state that would have been caused by observing that it's raining. And it's also the kind of brain state that would cause me to say it's raining. So thought is tied down both at the input and output ends. And that's because we've got audio in and audio out. But then along with emotions, we have visceral things like you sort of go red and your skin gets sweaty and your fists start clenching and you grind your teeth together. And a disembodied computer, a computer that was just kind of running in a data center, wouldn't have those visceral things. But I don't see why it shouldn't have the cognitive things. And when we build actual robots, they may well have visceral things too, but they'd probably be rather unlike our visceral things.
Yeah. I'm sure I'm not the only one hearing you who is thinking of Hal the computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, who did seem to exhibit many of these features of emotion, a different agenda than the controller, and so on and so forth. And even
I'm afraid I can't comment on that.
It's very interesting. I'm sorry you can't. I'd love to know what you thought.
No, I think once you get these smart chatbots, and once the smart chatbots are able to do things like, they're already getting to be able to order things on the web and so on, then we will start thinking about them just like we think about people. We'll attribute all those things to them. And you don't want to piss them off. And
do you assume that people will like them? Take your average American busy with social media. Will they come to love these social robots?
I think robots that have evolved to be liked, that have been designed and then learned to be liked, they'll like them a whole lot, possibly a lot more than people.
Right. And does that strike you as worrisome or not particularly important?
I have all sorts of mixed feelings about that. It's probably not going to be good for the fertility rate.
Which could be good in some places.
Maybe, but what if the only people having a lot of children are religious fundamentalists?
Yes, well, I'm going to move on to another question.
You better had.
Yeah. Given that you believe, first thanking you for your talk, given that you believe superintelligence may be in the very near future, are you personally doing anything to prepare for this circumstance?
I sometimes lie awake at night. Doesn't do much good. I haven't really absorbed it emotionally. And I'm 76, so I may now never have to absorb it emotionally, but I am very worried for my children. But I don't know what you do about it. I think building a bunker and getting a machine gun to keep other people out of it and putting lots of food inside, I don't think that's the way to go.
Yeah.
But it's not clear what is the way to go. I think the best thing we could do at present is try to keep democracy ticking over.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the only thing we can do at this point. Well,
sorry, one other thing. There was this period called the Enlightenment when it started to be the case that reason was listened to, even if it conflicted with religious ideas. And it seems to me we're losing that. In the 1950s, when I was growing up, we were still in the Enlightenment, and everybody was going to get more educated and more sensible. And now it doesn't look like that anymore. We're losing the Enlightenment, and that anything we can do to keep the faith in reason and experiment would be great. One
Well, one of the things that strikes me too is a little bit on another topic, which is, as a historian of science and technology, I have seen many examples of technologies and scientific systems that are created, but with great enthusiasm, but the dark side of the technology becomes apparent at some late stage. The atom bomb, for example, and people say, "What were you thinking? What were you
But
thinking?"
I want to interrupt there because I think the atom bomb is an odd case where there never was a bright side. It was always about destruction. The only bright side I know for the atom bomb was I once went on a train through Colorado, a long way away from any roads.
Yeah.
And someone announced that that was the site of peaceful uses of atomic bombs. And what they did was they used atom bombs for fracking. And now nobody can go anywhere near there. But apart from atom bombs for fracking, there never were good uses of them.
Okay, fair.
And AI is quite unlike that in that there's huge numbers of good use, particularly in medicine.
So what would you say about something like genetic technologies that, like CRISPR technology, that has great potential and great danger?
Right. I'd say that's in a similar category.
Right.
You're not going to stop it because of the great potential.
Correct.
But you need to do something about the great danger.
So when you're working on these systems, this is the question, is when you're working on these systems as a scientist, how do you come upon that realization? Was it there at the beginning when you thought about the problem? We find that many scientists talk about the beauty of the problem, the appeal of solving a very, very difficult, possibly impossible, challenging idea, and being just swept into something that is so appealing. And if you could imagine if you could really solve it, only to then discover how the dark side really is maybe more real.
That's certainly a factor. For me, I always believed that AGI was a long way off. And that if we could understand, so I was always making computer models, not in order to achieve AGI, but in order to try and understand how the brain worked.
Yeah.
And I always thought if we could understand more about how the brain worked, that might help a lot in making people behave in more rational, sensible ways. That, I guess, was an article of faith. And that AGI, and particularly superintelligence, was way, way in the future. So there's not much point thinking about that now.
Yeah.
And then I fairly suddenly changed that belief in about March of this year when I suddenly realized digital intelligence may just be a whole lot better. And because of that, it may get there fairly quickly.
Yeah. But you described that as being kind of a eureka moment in a way.
It was an epiphany, but it wasn't an entirely positive eureka moment.
Right.
It was a sudden realization that, hey, maybe I've been wrong about this, and maybe these things will soon be much more intelligent than us.
Yeah. That must have been a terrifying moment, really.
It was a bit, for me, it wasn't. It was worrying with respect to my children.
Well, now it is for all of us with children. We can all worry together. Do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay. Hang on. Here's someone who says, great speech, even if I do not understand everything. What would be your main argument to convince non-informed stakeholders that we live in a very dangerous period?
Get them to play with GPT-4. If they play with GPT-4 and ask it all sorts of questions, I think most reasonable people will come to the conclusion that this thing really is smart. And if you then look backwards 10 years at what we had 10 years ago, and even imagining that progress is only linear, if we had the same jump as we got from 10 years ago to now, we had a jump that size again 10 years in the future. It's quite scary what we would have by then.
So just play around with ChatGPT-4.
And convince yourself that it really does.
You will understand. Yeah.
And then think about how much better it is than what we had 10 years ago.
Yes.
And imagine getting that much better again in the next 10 years.
So I presume that although I mean, this is stating the obvious perhaps, but just because you have left Google does not mean that Google is no longer engaged in this research and accelerating it
I
dramatically.
was only a tiny part of their research effort.
Yeah.
I was there mainly to sort of give advice to the younger researchers who are actually doing the work. No, Google is going flat out on
Full
this. Now,
steam ahead.
Google did have a big lead in this, and it chose not to release it.
Hmm.
It had a lead in producing very realistic images and in these large language models.
Mhm.
And it realized how easily they were abused.
Mhm.
And it didn't want to ruin its reputation for producing things that were true, for being, reliable.
Yeah.
And so it didn't release these things. And it could afford to do that when it was the only company that had them.
Yeah.
But as soon as Microsoft released OpenAI's chatbot in Bing,
Mhm.
Google didn't have any choice but to play catch up. And they were behind in all the details that go into releasing these things.
Yeah.
They've more or less caught up now.
Yeah.
And from now on, it's going to be a competition between Google and Microsoft and maybe Facebook and possibly Amazon. And it's going to be very hard to slow it down.
And do you think the enthusiasm for this is based on is generationally defined? In other words, do you think that young people coming out of college today with degrees in computer science are excited about the appealing possibilities and for not paying attention to the dangers? Or do you think that they too are well aware and trying to figure it out?
I guess I don't have any data to base an answer on, but my guess is they have both feelings. That is very exciting. There's huge potential here.
Mhm.
They should definitely get into it, and they should either be doing it or using it in whatever else it is they do. But they're also, many of them, I think, will be aware of the dangers.
Yeah.
They've seen the dangers on social media, the polarization dangers from social media.
Yes. Well, we hope so. We hope they find them dangerous anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Geoffrey Hinton, this has been a tremendously interesting time with you. Thank you so much. If you have any last words, now is your moment.
Yeah, my last words are, this is a period of history we're entering, which is very uncertain. We've never before had to deal with even the possibility of things smarter than us.
Yeah.
And nobody knows what's going to happen. Some people are very confident it's all going to work out just fine. Other people are very confident it's going to be a complete disaster.
Yeah.
I think the best thing to do is keep a very open mind that we really don't know what's going to happen, but we should clearly be cautious if that's the case.
Okay. Words to live by. Thank you, Geoffrey Hinton.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.